So Joe's just going to join us.
How's that?
That's lovely. Good to see you. Full glory when you look. As I say, I'm loving the title of the talk. Is it hope and change in the face of crisis and collapse? I'm really looking forward now to hearing what all that is about. Now, off you go, and say I'll be back. I'll let you carry on with your presentation, and I shall return when you're finished for the Q&A session. Thank you, and look forward to it. Bye.
Thank you very much, Terry, and good to see you all today virtually. Thank you for the honor of inviting me to speak today. I'm very grateful to the Festival for Change for this opportunity, which has really forced me to take a step back and organize my thoughts about the nature of the current moment we're all in. And so, as was mentioned, I'm going to talk today about hope and change in the face of crisis and collapse. Before I do so, though, a few reflections on loss. I know that this is a very difficult time for many people. It certainly has been for me. This year just seems like blow after blow after blow. So much loss, politically, emotionally, that we've had dizzying moments of hope and opportunity along the way in the midst of it all only goes to make the crushing weight of defeat all the harder to bear. The December 2019 UK general election, the loss of the Corbyn project and of the Labour leadership, the defeat of the Sanders campaign here in the United States, the COVID pandemic, the police murders of George Floyd and so many others, and on and on and on. A week or so ago, the sky over San Francisco turned bright red in the middle of the day. The cause was the smoke from the surrounding fires, themselves a symptom of climate change and overdevelopment. But it had an eerie feeling of the end of the world about it. And it's almost like we're living through the end times at the moment. And that's even before we've gotten to the US presidential election in November. And to be perfectly honest, it can be an enormous mental health challenge just to hold it all, to live through it and somehow keep on going. People are struggling. I'm struggling. Crisis is layered on top of crisis. I see friends, family, colleagues struggling to cope with the weight of it all. And everyone has their own personal challenge, their own blows and wounds to contend with in the midst of everything else. Losing a family member or a friend, losing love. These blows can be the hardest to bear. It's no fun being brokenhearted in the apocalypse. And so I say all of this by way of vulnerability, just so you know, given what I'm about to say, that I feel it all too, and I'm struggling just like everyone else. I too know the weight of it all, and I certainly don't take lightly what I'm about to say. It can be hard to see the way ahead sometimes, to chart a forward course amidst deteriorating conditions and a world increasingly on fire. But there always is a way forward, even if we must strain every nerve and do our utmost to seek it out, even if sometimes it can seem like whistling in the dark. And so I'm thinking about how to go on and where we must go next, and that's where I'll end up. First, though, I want to talk about the crisis. Prior to this year, we were already facing a triple crisis: climate change, economic inequality, racial injustice. We've been feeling a great backlash in our politics. Everywhere, the far right is on the march, and increasingly it's entering government. And now, layered on top of that already dangerous triple crisis, making everything worse and more dangerous, is the pandemic and the accompanying economic crisis. At the Democracy Collaborative, we've been looking at COVID-19 as a major inflection point in US economic history and development. Back in March, just as the pandemic was beginning to unfold, it was already clear to us that we might find ourselves looking back on this period between the 2008 Great Financial Crisis and the COVID pandemic as the bookends of a period of transition, a transition from a dying neoliberalism to whatever it is that is going to come next, which could be either the democratic economy many of us are calling for, or it could be something much, much darker. And at the Collaborative, we laid out in March 3 scenarios for post-COVID, which we called the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if you want to see them, they're written up briefly on our website. Since then, we've set up internally a COVID tracker project in-house, which we've been using to gather the available data, media reports, and published analysis to maintain a database of sorts on what we think are going to be the cascading effects of the pandemic and the accompanying economic crisis. And what we're finding is, frankly, terrifying. In March, we believed that we were facing an economic crisis that was unprecedented in modern history, so we started gathering the preliminary data suggesting how bad and how deep it might be. Now, 6 months on, we have a much clearer picture, although it's by no means a full picture, and there is still considerable uncertainty. To begin with a small consolation, some of the economic effects have not been as bad as some had predicted. For instance, some economists were predicting an unemployment rate in the United States of around 32%, with 52.8 million Americans out of work in the second quarter. What actually happened is that the US unemployment rate peaked at 14.7% in April and has since fallen back to 8.4%. However, at least part of the reason is that we prematurely exited lockdown and failed to control the spread of COVID. Policymakers essentially made a decision to prioritize the economy over public health. And I know we've seen something similar to that in the UK. What makes things worse is that despite this decision, we are still, by almost every measure, in a deep economic crisis, the likes of which has not been seen in America in generations. Let me give you some data. First is GDP. I don't love GDP as an indicator, but it's broadly indicative of what's happening in the economy. And back in March, economists were predicting a decline in GDP of around 30% in the second quarter. That prediction was right on the money. In quarter two, GDP declined almost 10% on a quarterly basis, which represents an annualized rate of 32.9%. This is, quite simply, the largest decline since comparable records started to be collected after World War II, and likely only comparable to the Great Depression in its severity. And of course, it's in a concentrated period. We've seen this happen in 5 months rather than 5 years. Despite the unemployment rate being lower than predicted, around 26 million people were still claiming unemployment benefits as of mid-August. And researchers are now predicting that anywhere from 32 to 42% of the jobs lost during the pandemic will be lost permanently. And that's part of the reason why we've yet to see, and likely will not see, any sort of full V-shaped recovery, as has been hoped for by some, especially the Trump administration. And as workers have lost their jobs, they and their family members have also lost their health insurance in staggering numbers. From February to June alone, it's estimated that 12 million people lost their employer-sponsored health insurance. In July, one study found that more than 5.4 million people who had lost their jobs currently had no form of health insurance in the midst of a global pandemic. For comparison, this number was 3.9 million during the financial crisis and Great Recession 10 years ago. Related to job losses and pay cuts, housing insecurity has also increased dramatically. While homelessness and evictions have been mitigated for the past several months due to eviction moratoriums in many US states, as these come to an end, we're likely to see a big jump in homelessness and displacement. In terms of poverty as a whole, while we won't have the official numbers for 2020 until this time next year, there are signs of a significant increase. For instance, in June, reports suggested that around 14 million children were living in food-insecure households. By comparison, at the peak of the Great Recession, this number was 5.1 million. Related to this, over the past several months, there have been increasing reports from many areas of the country about incredible lines outside of food banks and other charitable institutions. In March, one of the things we worried about was the potential of the pandemic and the economic crisis to have a devastating impact on small businesses and local public budgets and services, and the possibility that there would be a disaster capitalist response and a so-called Amazon recovery, where corporate and elite control of the economy is strengthened and inequality increases. This was the ugly scenario in the schema that we laid out, and unfortunately, that appears to be very much the path that we're currently on. Small business closures are significantly higher than at any point during the Great Recession, and many of these businesses will never reopen again. At the same time, many large corporations have been able to weather the crisis, taking advantage of their economic and political power to secure billions in loans, subsidies, and other public assistance. And, of course, private equity sharks are flush with cash and, along with the corporations, they're waiting in the wings and will be starting to snap up small and medium-sized enterprises and other troubled businesses for cents on the dollar. Linked to the loss of local businesses, state and local budgets are also in absolute free fall. While the full extent of the impact is not yet known, it's becoming clear that state and local governments will be facing revenue shortages significantly greater than they faced during the Great Recession. And since state and local government must, by law, balance their budgets, unless the federal government does more to come to their aid, we're likely going to be seeing a period of deep austerity, where spending on social services is slashed, pension funds become insolvent, public sector employees are laid off, and public assets are sold off. Anecdotally, we're already starting to see this as municipality after municipality has announced budget cuts in recent months. Beyond this, there's the very real possibility of a slew of municipal bankruptcies, which will not only exacerbate all of the austerity measures, but will also remove all vestiges of local democratic control over them. Lastly, it's no surprise that the economic effects of this crisis are not being felt equally and are significantly exacerbating racial and economic inequality. Over the summer, my colleagues prepared a long working paper on racial and ethnic economic inequality in the COVID pandemic. And in the paper, they looked at how racial disparities in the economy are showing up in the pandemic, how racial disparities are showing up in the public policy responses to the pandemic, and how the effects of the pandemic might impact racial economic inequality. In terms of unemployment, since the financial crisis and Great Recession 10 years ago, the racial and ethnic gap in the official unemployment rate has been slowly narrowing back to its historical, yet still unacceptable norm, with the rate for black people about twice as high as the rate for white people. Specifically, the gap between the white unemployment rate and the black unemployment rate had shrunk from 7.6 percentage points to 2.4 percentage points over the course of 10 years. Between white and Hispanic people, the gap had shrunk from 3.9% to 0.9%. However, in just the past 6 months, most of the gains of the past 10 years have been wiped out. The gap between the white unemployment rate and the black unemployment rate is currently back up to 5.7 percentage points. And the gap between the white unemployment rate and the Hispanic unemployment rate is back up to 3.2 percentage points. Finally, one more statistic. While tens of millions of people are suffering in this economy, there's one group actually who's doing quite well. Since the onset of the pandemic, the total wealth of US billionaires has increased by a whopping $800 billion. So, it's a pretty dire picture, all things considered, and we're far from over the hump of this crisis. Depending on what happens with the public health dimensions of the crisis and the search for a vaccine, it's perfectly possible that we will see further extended economic effects unfolding open-endedly into the future. We've clearly taken, or are taking, at least partially, the path of the ugly scenario that we'd laid out, in which a premature exit from lockdown throws many of our most vulnerable citizens under the bus in the name of the resumption of economic normalcy. And only time will tell what form the political response to this murderous decision will take. Looking further out, we see major changes. The nature and organization of work and public space may be permanently altered by the pandemic. The way we go about travel, transport, leisure, sport, culture, romance, hospitality and dining, not to mention healthcare and public order, could all end up being transformed by the after effects of COVID-19. Finance too could be altered, and the disparities between what's happening on the ground in the real economy and the movements of the stock market have never been clearer. The disconnect is becoming an unbridgeable chasm with a parasitic financial sector that seems to feed almost vampire-like on our actual blood and suffering and deaths. Then there are the things that we haven't thought of yet, the second and third order cascading economic effects of the crisis. So to summarize what all this means, we think that, even if the worst versions of the possible effects we were worried about haven't materialized, at least yet, the scope and scale of the economic effects is much, much larger than is being commonly appreciated. And that means that the scale of our response ought to be commensurate with that. We should be looking at a recovery that mobilizes a response at least on the scale of the New Deal. And that isn't even taking into account what will be necessary to move from addressing this crisis to the even bigger looming challenge of climate change. This means an all-of-government response. But nothing remotely like this is on the table from anybody in the mainstream political debate. And here I'd like to switch gears from the looming threats of crisis and collapse to what to do about it, to hope and change. And the good news is that we increasingly know that we have our hands on some powerful answers to many of these problems we're facing. At the Democracy Collaborative, we call these new approaches and solutions community wealth building, but others are developing allied approaches, whether they're called the new economy, the well-being economy, the solidarity economy, the social economy, and much more. And what all these approaches have in common is that they all look to reconfigure the basic institutions and relationships of the economy in fundamental ways so that it produces radically different outcomes as a matter of course. And what does this economy look like? It is a moral economy, a democratic economy. Finance in this economy is put back in service of people, communities, and the planet. In this economy, labor comes before capital. Good, decent work is a core social aim and source of individual development. Ownership is not concentrated, but broad-based and widely shared. And stewardship is the basis of ownership, not exploitation. This is a real and not a financialized economy. All economic activity occurs in real places, and communities are able to take control of their own destinies. It's a collaborative economy in which human flourishing occurs in healthy communities and a livable planet. This economy recognizes that we have only one planet to live on, in which all life is interdependent and real ecological boundaries require limits to growth. Human development is the real face of freedom, requiring the removal of unfreedoms, such as poverty and the lack of opportunity. Government plays a big role in this economy in a democratic and decentralized fashion. It's recognized that our collective ability to govern ourselves is the bedrock of the good society. The institutions of this democratic economy are consciously designed and controlled to serve the common good. This economy can be a little hard to imagine given today's extractive economy, perhaps because we've forgotten how to hope, how to demand. We've impoverished our imaginations, and as a result, it's harder to imagine an economy in which, when we wake up each day, we can know that in and of itself, the economy will produce better outcomes, greater equality, more democracy, healthier people and communities, a cleaner environment. It's hard to imagine, but it's not impossible. And more people are doing it. And this is the really good news that I'm bringing to you. Yes, the world is on fire. Yes, millions are living in economic anxiety. Yes, we're losing animal and plant species every day to a sixth great extinction. Yes, there are only 60 harvests left given the depletion of the soils. Yes, a handful of billionaires, soon to be trillionaires, own as much wealth as the rest of us put together. Yes, all this is true. But there's also this new democratic economy in the making, a real economy on the ground, another future. And that future too is already here. It's just not yet evenly distributed. And so these new economic models and approaches must now become the norm, not the exception. We need to be able to provide whole of jurisdiction blueprints for how to put approaches like community wealth building at the center of local and regional economies. We must make the post-COVID era a new era of economic democracy. Whether we can have a recovery led from the federal level will be dependent on what happens here in Washington, D.C. in November and afterwards. But we know that there will also have to be state and local responses. And this means that the whole of the public sector at the state and local level should be mobilized, including local government, education, health, public policy, not-for-profit activity, forming the basis for re-exerting wholesale local economic control and reconstruction. Civil society organizations and political leaders must mobilize together to rapidly plan how to direct public resources toward building the ecosystems and structures of community wealth. Community wealth building practice must shift to meet the scale of the current emergency, going beyond pilots and demonstration projects to help deliver a thoroughgoing recovery and reconstruction through economic transformation. Post-COVID, we need to create an economy where the needs of the community, as well as the imperative to live within planetary boundaries, come before the prerogatives of private capital. And there are clear principles for the recovery that flow from this. We must resist the calls for cuts to public sector jobs and spending. Public and tax-favored private institutions should evaluate all of their purchasing and procurement to see how much can be routed to local and democratically owned businesses. They should develop incentives for relocalizing procurement, since we have seen how global supply chains have broken down so spectacularly in the pandemic. And when possible, manufacturing should be brought back from overseas to local communities and kept in the hands of businesses that are broadly owned to create greater resilience. It's a kind of ironic turn of events, but these approaches and strategies that were developed for the Rust Belt are now suddenly applicable to the entirety of the national economy, as that whole economy has begun to look like the Rust Belt, with swathes of lost small businesses and shuttered storefronts. And so, community wealth building principles are uniquely positioned to be at the heart of the economic response and the recovery. These are the stakes, and we have to ask ourselves whether we're ready to rise to the scale of the challenge. And this is where I leave you, with a question and a hope. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and it's up to all of us to push this agenda of economic transformation if we're to avoid a continuing spiral and descent into civilizational collapse. We know the program. We already know the fundamentals of a viable next system, a democratic, community-sustaining political economy that operates within planetary boundaries where all can thrive. We have strong evidence for the effectiveness of democratic economy models and community wealth building approaches as meaningful responses to our growing crises. However, a dangerous chasm remains between the solutions that we know are practicable and necessary to address these overlapping crises of climate, inequality, racial injustice, pandemic, and what is proving to be saleable politically. The two most promising recent opportunities to implement large-scale aspects of this agenda, Jeremy Corbyn's New Economics and Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal, have come up radically short when put to the electoral test, and this has been especially true among working-class communities who should be among their chief beneficiaries. And here's the crux of the matter. We've developed solutions and a program way in advance of the social forces and the political groundwork required to carry them to victory. And the only way to change this is to roll up our sleeves and develop a powerful program of political education around economic alternatives in communities, many of which have seen such capacities hollowed out, sometimes lost entirely after decades of neoliberalism. And this is particularly urgent given the rising tide of the far right and the widespread uptake of all manner of conspiracy theories that are filling the vacuum that we've left behind with the absence of such a program. So it's time to get concrete and specific about political education, community organizing, and local actions. We must develop powerful political education tools that can begin to close the gap between the understanding most people have of their material interests and the newly emerging economic paradigm. We need a political education push and a mobilization around movement building, the likes of which the world has never seen. We need a massive infusion of democracy into our politics, the media, the economy, and our communities. There's no shortcut and no other way. To borrow a phrase beloved of our neoliberal opponents, there is no alternative. So let me leave you with a final quote from Angela Davis that I personally am taking as my mantra for the months and years ahead. And this is what Angela Davis said. You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world. And you have to do it all the time. Radical simply means grasping things at the roots. Sometimes we have to do the work, even though we don't see a glimmer on the horizon that it's actually going to be possible. Hope and change in the face of crisis and collapse. Thank you.
Wow. Powerful stuff, Joe. Thanks very much for that.
Thanks, Terry.
That's the call to action. I heard one. Now, you were a speaker who was nominated actually by one of our participants, and the prize for that is that individual gets to ask you the first question. So I was all ready to begin with some initial ones, but the honour will be Parmjit Nahal. And I would say that was a really fascinating talk. Thank you so much. Over to you, Parmjit.
Thanks, Terry. Hi, Joe.
Hi,
The reason
Parmjit.
I nominated you was because I read this book that you've written with Martin O'Neill. I didn't actually know that you were in America, but you seem to have UK overtones in your speech. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, your background?
Certainly. Certainly, and thank you so much for the nomination. And it was a real pleasure and an opportunity to focus my mind on thinking through some of these things. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Yes, I sound a little bit like I have a transatlantic drawl, and that's because I've lived in the United States for about 20 years now. But prior to that, I grew up in the north of England, in Blackburn in Lancashire. So I'm from the sort of UK equivalent of the Rust Belt, and my dad actually was from Northern Ireland, so I've got sort of a foot in both Ireland and the UK. And so prior to the pandemic, I was spending a lot of time back and forth to the UK, and I've been very involved in the sort of unfolding of the movement for community wealth building on the ground in the UK, which is, I would say, probably at the tip of the spear internationally now in terms of community wealth building practice, having gone far beyond some of the things that we managed to do in the United States. So people like the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, working with an increasing number of jurisdictions in the UK, are really pushing these strategies forward. And it's been really exciting and rewarding to me to see them sort of come home. Sometimes you've got to go all the way around the world to get back to where you started.
That's true. So are you saying that in comparison to America, that the UK seems to be pushing ahead more successfully?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And it's interesting that it's the UK and the US, which in many ways were the first advanced industrial economies that went into neoliberalism and have borne the brunt, and in some ways had seen the rot go the deepest. And born of this pain has been this response at the community level. And we saw it really unfolding across the United States over the last couple of decades. And the Democracy Collaborative was created and tracks this unfolding of cooperatives and community land trusts and neighborhood development and so on. And then back in around 2012, the leap was made from some of the models that we built of community wealth building in the United States. It was taken up and actually implemented in Preston, which is just 15 miles from where I grew up, just down the road, by Matthew Brown, who's a councillor there, who is now the leader of Preston City Council. And the Preston model has come to be widely known. And now more and more jurisdictions in the UK are going further, I think, than we managed to do with any of the work we've done on community wealth in the United States, in part because local government is able to lead in a different way. And there's also, there's just a different political tradition around some of this stuff, I think, that opens up different possibilities.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I appreciated the fact that you shared your vulnerabilities at the beginning of the talk. That's quite a nice kind of female-orientated approach to things, and I do think that more female, what's the word I'm looking for, Joe? It's like to
values,
yes,
approaches.
That's right, to balance up the kind of masculine focus on numbers and statistics and policies and the rest of it. This is a question I've just thought of just as we've been talking, actually. And what it is how do you think that an organisation, I don't know if we're an organisation, but a project such as the Festival for Change can align itself to push things? You said that the UK's kind of doing pretty well in some areas, but in other areas it's kind of not so good, really. It's very dependent on whether people who have positioned themselves as gatekeepers in anchor organisations and so on and so forth, how aware they are. And there's a lot of belligerence in many areas, as well as some areas that are doing very, very well. So how could a project such as Festival for Change position itself to really bring out the bits that are doing well and say, hey, look at this, everybody, as a way of pushing the agenda kind of forward? I don't know if that's a bit cheeky, because it's Henry's baby.
I should ask a similar thing, actually, because there is about what local actions can lead to other ripples. So take it away, Joe, because this is close to all our hearts.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think there's one of the things that's really important about this moment is the power of ideas, which, you know, there are long periods of history where ideas don't really matter and where the, you know, things are settled down. But that's not what this period feels like. I don't know. There's that famous phrase about there being decades in which nothing happens and then years in which decades happen. And those are the years that we're living through. There's so much change, so much flux, and people are looking for ways of understanding. And so I think, you know, the Festival for Change is an important example of a place where these ideas can be spread and then disseminated. And what's really important, and that's what I was calling for really in this sort of urging of a great era of democracy at the end, is that I think we all need to sort of think hard about the fact that nobody is coming to save us, that we are the ones that we've been waiting for, that the tools and the models and the approaches that we need to transform the economy in the direction that climate change and social pain and other things demand are all available. And it's simply the case for us that we need to turn outside, I think, of ourselves and of our bubbles and of the sort of narrow conversations that we sometimes have with each other, preaching to the converted, and really turn out in a way into community and get this conversation happening everywhere. It's very difficult under pandemic conditions, but we'll see what happens in the future. It's very unclear to me whether there's lockdown or not.
It's very confusing.
There is
At
much.
the moment. It's very confusing.
It's very confusing.
But there are, even under lockdown conditions, there are ways of communicating and of forming groups and of beginning to disseminate. You mentioned the book. That's not just my book. There's other books and articles and loads of material available online. The Center for Local Economic Strategies has got reams of material that can be used for. And what we need to get people asking is the question of what's happening. Where's the money going? If a local government is spending it in a certain way, follow the money. What benefit? What double duty can it be made to do? How, you know, we need to move away from these really narrow unit cost, lowest sort of common denominator approaches to the local economy and really start thinking about economies as ecosystems and thinking about the full impact that we can have if we were to redirect the public sector, which is a big chunk of any local economy.
Yeah.
And that's the place to start because it's our money.
Yeah, I was a little bit disappointed by your support of GDP.
Yeah, I'm not really a supporter of GDP, but what we're doing is looking just for indicators of to get a sense of the magnitude of what's happening. Because my sense is that we can't afford to wait for a year until we get sort of all the economic reports and see how everything lands. We need to track this thing in real time and intervene now. One of the proposals we've come out with is an intervention to protect small and medium-sized businesses and carry them through the crisis. Many of them are viable and will be viable again, and yet they face the risk of shutting down or being gobbled up by private equity. And so, yeah, all we've been doing is trying to get a real sense of the scale of this and basically say it looks like something like stitching the Great Depression and the Spanish flu together. And so we need a policy response as big as that. I certainly don't believe in GDP as the measure of how we should be steering our economy, but it's just a kind of those up and down big shifts are just to give people a sense of how big this is. 5 months we've seen a contraction comparable to 5 years of contraction during the Great Depression.
Do you want me to carry on, Terry?
Well, I was just saying you're doing a fine job, but I did want to just you kind of asked me a lot of things I would have asked, so that's been great. No, it's been lovely. You stay. I mean, you know, if anybody else would like to ask a question, please do use the Q&A panel to the right of the screen. But I just want to pick up. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can either stay or go and write down some questions, but happy for you to stay, actually.
Okay.
But yes, Joe, just picking up on that actual fact is what was burning in my head is the stats you said, the difference in 5 months since the Great Depression and World War II, all those numbers are incredibly frightening, to say the least. So you talk about big and making actions that actually land. How do we go about that? I mean, is that a local driven initiatives, or is it, you know, what can individuals do? Should we start there?
Everything starts with individuals, and small groups of individuals are the people that have changed the world time and time again. And so, again, I think I want to leave people with a sense that there's plenty that you can do, and you can start immediately in your own neighborhood. in terms of political education and conversations along the lines that I was talking about. We need people to understand that there's nothing natural about the economic order that we've got around us. It's one that we've created, and it's one that we can redesign to function in a different way. So the work of conversations and of sort of person to person beginning to sort of surface the fact that there are real alternatives. And you spend time talking to people, and pretty quickly they'll see the follies of privatization or of letting the stock market, run the economy when it's got no relation to what's really going on the ground, and so on. And so then I think there's gradations of involvement that you can pursue, including getting involved in local political campaigns and activity, asking questions of your local councillors, becoming your local councillors. There's that great phrase of the community organizing movement in the United States that if you can't change your leaders, change your leaders. And so we can ask and demand a better response and a different way of doing business by councils and local authorities. And if that doesn't happen, then we got to run against them and replace them. But luckily, there is a wave increasingly of councils across the UK and across the United States where we're seeing these actions and activities and approaches taken up and implemented. And once you can start pointing to real things and things that are really being done, it's not as easy to say that that's not possible or it can't be done. We're now running into another argument, which is, oh, we're already doing it. In which case, let's really test that and hold it to account and see, let's do analyses of local spend and see how much money really is being spent locally with local businesses. Because every time you spend money locally with local businesses, it recirculates in ways that if you spend it with a big multinational, it exits your community straight away. The multiplier effect is thought to be about 8. So that means £1 spent with a local business gets spent 8 times before it leaves the community, rather than once and then off to the corporate headquarters and probably beyond that to the tax haven. So we need to be pressing these issues with our local representatives and creating democratic accountability and pressure from below to bring about these changes.
You need a certain chutzpah and confidence to do that, don't you? So it's getting that strength of voice to make it heard, really. And I was going to just ask about other examples. You mentioned Preston, but are there any specific other things that you feel really, yes, there is change afoot?
Yeah, more and more places are starting to really take up, and community wealth building is our particular frame, but there's other approaches to the new economy that are happening all around. My favourite example at the moment is North Ayrshire, which is the Scottish council just outside of Glasgow, where they've become the first self-proclaimed community wealth building council in Scotland, and have built a very comprehensive plan that now links also to plans for a local Green New Deal about how to really reorient their investment, their workforce development, their procurement, and use all the levers that are available to them to do a really comprehensive approach that I think is probably one of the most exciting and ambitious versions of a community wealth building plan anywhere in the world at the moment. So we're seeing that, but there are many others. Just yesterday, Wirral Council just elected the first female leader in the Merseyside area, Jan Williamson, who's prior to that had been the council lead for community wealth building. And I know that they're going to be taking this forward. We see it with Jamie Driscoll in North of Tyne. And increasingly, we're also seeing big institutions start to pay attention. The National Health Service is one of the largest employers, and you can imagine the scale of procurement that happens through the NHS. And they've written this notion of themselves as an anchor institution into their long-term strategy. And so I think there's a lot. You could easily see the National Health Service as the sort of backbone of an industrial strategy that then begins to produce generic pharmaceuticals through worker co-ops that are, rather than paying high drug prices internationally and so on. And I think the possibility for pulling these supply chains in and doing a lot of things much more locally and at home and doing double duty with that public money. So we're not just getting the goods and services we need, we're also building our communities and our neighborhoods and building the economic basis of a different way of doing business.
So here's the thing, because I've heard the phrase "we're already doing it" quite a bit, and it's always invariably comes from people who aren't and who have got no idea about how to even start doing it. So I'm just wondering whether like if we had regional kind of, I don't know, you call them committees or groups or something, and so they would act as champions to promote areas like Ayrshire and Wirral, and I think Frome is somewhere that's doing very well.
Yeah.
I've heard about that. And so the CLES organisation, CLES, could maybe be an organisation that could coordinate that kind of a thing, and we could link into something like Festival of Change to actually promote, you know, what's so good, what is it that they're doing that's good that other people can then start to, you know, look at. And finally, I just wanted to throw in the Green New Deal for Europe. Have you positioned yourself anywhere within that?
I think to start with the Green New Deal and work backwards from there, I think the Green New Deal frame is a really important one, and one that seems to be having a lot of resonance in Europe and the UK, even though it's a phrase that originates in American politics with the New Deal and Roosevelt and the Great Depression. But I think bringing together the imperatives of how we recover from COVID, but also look ahead to prepare the economy that we're going to need in order to make the massive transition away from carbon that has to happen in a very short space of time if we're to remain within any kind of hope of safety on climate change. And so I think you see linkages already being made, like North Ayrshires, where they've got a community wealth building strategy, and they're also trying to layer in a local Green New Deal. And then certainly this needs to scale. And I think what we need to see is a massive expansion of this type of activity horizontally through replication, but then eventually it needs to get to the national level and national policy and international policy. And so that's the ultimate goal, where we're going to see some of the really big payoffs. And then on the question of what people can do, and I think we see this as a failing at the Democracy Collaborative. I know Claes feels the same way. We haven't quite yet sort of weaponized these ideas, if I can use that metaphor, in a way that people can take them, ordinary people. So we need to be developing training materials and toolkits and things so that this becomes much more accessible and available to people, so that they can take it off and do it themselves. We're only a limited number of people, and this is often a fairly technocratic exercise of working with local public officials, but there actually needs to be a democratic movement. And for a democratic movement, there needs to be popular education, and for there to be popular education around this, we need to produce better materials and bring this stuff to the level where people can actually see it and understand it and know what questions to ask in their local jurisdictions and what to be looking for from their anchor institutions. And because a lot of this stuff is just basic common sense when you really get down to it.
Absolutely.
But we haven't done a good job of communicating.
Absolutely. But there needs to be quite a political sea change, would you say, in terms of making any of this stick? There's a lot of barriers, is a nice way of putting it, perhaps, to actually getting these ideas heard.
I think political with the small p, because I know that you were sticking up for Labour and what was his name in
Corbyn.
Corbyn, and also in America, Bernie Sanders. Yeah. But I do think that this kind of crosses political boundaries, because at the end of the day, something that's going to protect the environment, policies that are going to protect jobs and food and water, they have to be cross-political. You can't ask people.
But don't you find, economies by the people, for the people, need some definite weight behind them to make it happen? And it's that
if I go to a councillor that gets it, that councillor at the moment, okay, he's more likely to be Labour, but if we're educating everybody within our neighbourhood and community, then everybody needs to get on board. And if we've got a democracy, we need to find processes where we're listening to both sides and listening to concerns on both sides and coming up with new processes. So, you know, I think it's very limited where politics can actually get us at the end of the day.
I think I'm talking purely about power.
Yeah.
All right. We have leaders that make some really, what should I say, interesting decisions. And they aren't for the common good by any means. And we've had that. COVID pandemic has, as we've said time and time again, exposed such flaws. You've said yourself, Joe, the inequalities were there, but they've been exacerbated. And the amount of change you've described is so immense that it's just looking for that bigger actions. I totally am with you both on individuals taking charge and spreading the word, but I do wonder about how can things really be fast-tracked a bit.
Well, this is why I think the Green New Deal is really good, because they've got stuff in place for policy, kind of looking at it from a top level, but part of it is that it's got to be driven by communities.
Yeah.
You know, they kind of recognise that from the outset, so that both things can develop and one feeds into the other. So I think it's very exciting if we can actually make the most of those kinds of policies. I don't know if policies is the right word, but
approaches and stuff. Well,
approaches.
Joe, I mean, Joe, your the Democracy Collaborative is a think do tank, and so what specific actions? You said about the good, the bad, the ugly. Is it within that those parameters that there's examples of what to do and how to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think this conversation about politics is a really important one, and I think I agree that what we need to do is to develop a small p politics around this that can carry much further than beyond political party boundaries, and just wrap. This is existential, right? This is really civilizational. It's about how we live and whether we can continue to live in many cases around the world. And I think sort of organizing a new kind of common sense that can carry the day, across the board. And we see already some interesting, strange bedfellows beginning to emerge around some of these ideas. There's the overall frame, and that'll be politically contested, but there's also the institutions within that. So, there's a big move afoot to create community banks around the UK at the moment to really break the deadlock that the big five banks, commercial banks, have. And these banks are able to draw support from Conservative councils as well as from Labour councils, and make sense. They require banking licenses. They're real banks. They're real institutions like credit unions and so forth. And so a lot of these, cooperatives, for example, we've seen a lot of flirting with the idea of worker ownership by the Conservative Party in recent years. I don't know if you remember, George Osborne even at one point was promoting worker ownership and various forms of cooperatives. I had some differences over what he was proposing. He was proposing that people give up some of their workplace rights in exchange for a share of ownership in the business. But I think even this shows the spreading of the idea of giving people an ownership stake and a different way of thinking about the economy. The idea that we just let the whole thing run and then we try and correct the outcomes by redistribution, by taxes, by public spending. I think that has to go out the window. What we've got to do is rewire the economy in a deep way so that it actually works to produce the outcomes in and of itself that we want to see. And a lot of these institutions are growing up and proving to be extremely practical and viable, and they make sense. And when you zoom all the way down to the larder in Preston, it's not such a big ideological political contest. It's an example of a real business that's got real supply chains and has to balance the books at the end of the day, and there are all the business skills that are required in that. But it's also serving a social purpose and helping to build the local economy and the green economy and the sustainable economy and the more equitable and inclusive economy that we need.
Yes, I do believe that activities that have happened, movements like Black Lives Matter and all of the other things, the cooperatives and the credit unions and all of that, there are definite examples that have given more rise to people believing that these things can be done differently. But what do you say about the attitude, the stewardship you mentioned? Moving towards that, I think is in a number of different elements of life. Actually, it's not about dictating, but working together.
My colleague Marjorie Kelly at the Democracy Collaborative, who's written a number of books, very good books, has long been talking about this idea of capital bias, which is the way that we look at the economy, and it's the lens that we look through. We can see the sort of, even in the notion that that profits are to be seen as good and therefore returns to capital and to be maximized. But returns to labor, wages, are seen as a cost, an input into production that we need to shrink down and get rid of, rather than actually seeing this as being part of what we need for essential social reproduction and the lifeblood of the economy. So even just taking a shift of a, and you see this capital bias in the very spreadsheets, the way that we kind of understand how a business is operating, as well as the economy as a whole. And so we need some new lenses and some new ways of thinking about economics and about putting the economy back in service of people, of planet, of community, rather than thinking that we all have to madly scramble in order to serve the economy as some force out there over which we have no control.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And we've had in the festival a number of examples of people who are taking charge and making the difference. They're the examples we want to also share. And this is what, Parmjit, your point about the festival and how it can help is exactly that, is promoting these ideas and spreading the word. The more people there are, especially, you can have that acting locally is absolutely imperative, but it's also thinking globally.
I think things are
Give
starting
it
to
some
hot
movement.
up. Yeah, and actually, I think that the COVID has actually been a positive force in the sense that it's made people sit up and look around and see what's happening and link up with people that they normally wouldn't have done.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, would you find that, Joe, in your last 5 months?
Absolutely. The sort of explosion of the mutual aid networks that were, the immediate response. And you see these in conservative shire counties in the UK, as well as in urban, city areas, and people coming forward and realizing that they've got to look out for each other and figure out ways of taking care of one another in this crisis. And I think there is a possibility in moments of crisis like this of it coming together. And that's the opportunity that we really need to be looking for in order to really move what has been, a very productive, very creative explosion of experimentation and models. But what I was trying to say in my talk was, I think we now got to move from these kind of, intriguing sort of models here and there and experiments to actually mainstreaming that. So the whole economy starts to look like that.
Yeah. And I
There's
think
a question that's come in from Felix that I've just posted up.
Is there? Okay. What are the ways to help if you are a student not far from graduating?
Figure out ways to get involved. And
Does it come through the chat?
If you're a student.
Yeah, he put it on the chat, so I just pasted it up for him.
Yeah, but this whole festival is for enabling young people to get energized, and they are. I mean, there's been a lot of focus, but yes, I think specifically.
So one of the big sectors that can really serve as anchors, and we use this as part of the original community wealth building initiative in Cleveland, Ohio, was that we were really organizing the universities and the hospitals there as the procurement base to do things differently. And so if you're not far from graduating, cause a bit of trouble at the university on the way out in terms of asking the university authorities what they're doing to be a good citizen in the community and to take their procurement and their impact on land and all the other different ways in which because the universities are huge economic engines and actors, and that money is essentially public and tax subsidized one way or another, and really ought to be be one of the the streams of economic activity that can really drive community wealth building. So, get onto the university authorities and ask them why aren't they on board with examining their procurement and thinking about their their possibility of as an engine of community wealth building in their own neighborhoods and communities, and start there. And then I think it's about get involved, talk, discuss with people. We need that great era of democracy and discussion to get these ideas spread far and
You
wide.
believe like activism, getting that spark is what we need to light the flame for. And that's, I think, events like this and talks like yours. So I think we're going to wrap up in a minute. Parmjit, have you got any other questions you'd like to personally ask? Because I was just going to ask Joe one last thing. You go for it.
Yes, you can. You go.
No, go.
Oh, okay. No, I think I've kind of covered the ground I wanted to cover. I've noticed that in the chat things stay up, whereas question and answer they disappear. So I've put up a link for the Green New Deal there for people to look at, because I find it really, really impressive actually, and I think that the more people and organisations can link into the lead that they're providing, that
actually, let's just get
we're all pulling and pushing in one direction, then the better that's going to be.
Absolutely. Can I just ask Felix to come up, because I just realised he's had a few.
Felix.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm going to go off camera now then.
Okay.
Lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Really good to talk to you. And thanks for the
Bye.
nomination.
Thank you.
Felix can come up. Felix, are you there? Sorry, I missed that he had actually asked a number of things in the general chat, which is one of the ways he's already done a bit. He was the person who suggested them keeping their ethical investments. Hey, Felix,
hi,
thanks for joining us. Can
sorry,
you
my headphones
able to?
My thing's a bit tangled. I'll just fix that in a moment.
I missed. I was looking at the wrong thing. Okay, so we'll carry on with what he had put. He'd said that, plus he'd said not with fossil fuels, but more broad evils such as arms and tobacco and gambling and things like that. So
Yeah,
sorry.
I think it's
ethical investments. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So how do we move from, in a sense, a situation where we're screening bad things out, right? Which is where a lot of very important wedge into economic alternatives, to actually not just insisting that we don't do unethical investments, but that we actually pursue proactively the kinds of investments that are needed in community in terms of meeting real needs, housing, jobs creation, environmental sustainability, and so on. So I think that's the sort of the next step after ethical investing.
Okay, so Felix, were you able to get that?
Yes, most of it, I think. I think I missed about 30 seconds to a minute, but basically to further the ethical investments, so to divest from fossil fuels and make sure to keep, basically develop, words
Okay.
me. Basically to invest back in the local community and try to use local services.
Yes, absolutely. Is that right, Joe? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, you are a recent graduate, is that right?
No, I am in my third year and I'll be graduating, well, in
I see. So you're looking ahead. Good thinking then. Yeah, but it is very much about, getting your ducks in a row.
Yeah, definitely. Just a lot to
Do you
say.
feel there is other young people your friends, other people feel much like you? I mean, is there a groundswell of awareness? We talked about COVID, the pandemic actually highlighting a lot of these things.
Generally, yes, there is awareness. I'm friends with a fair few. Well, a lot of my friends are more of the. So tell me if my audio is bad as well.
I can hear you. Can you hear, Joe? Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you fine. It's just sometimes the microphone's a bit dodgy. But going back, there are a lot of people aware. At least the ones I'm friends with, like there is a general sense of apathy from a few people towards like student organizations, for example, the Students' Union. However, it's not as dire as you would think, because it also depends, because some people are there just to be students, others are more interested in why I'm so changing things. But yes,
Who needs to, do you think, affect them directly? Something that puts a fire in their belly?
in a sense, like especially with the recent COVID things, like it's so far our student association needs ultimately more student backing, but like for example, the uni charges. Oh yeah, I don't know if you're aware in Dundee. Sorry, I'll speak better. Dundee, Parker House. The recent coronavirus outbreak in general in student halls.
Oh, okay.
Um, Basically, long story short, I think that will definitely help make people aware how little rights you have in terms of student accommodation. You can't, in Scotland, tenants law is actually fairly good. It's a rolling 30-day and you can quit any time, but in student halls, you can't really do much. Likewise here, unless you're from England, student loans are not really that big of a problem. But it just largely, I think this will definitely help to highlight the issues to people who would not be aware of it, as long as they're able to see that this is a thing that can be changing, not rather becoming complacent with it.
Yes. But, yeah. So, Joe, let's have a last few words from you about what is it that we can keep the hope going.
Well, I think I get great hope from the younger generations, actually. And Felix, not to put pressure on you, but I think if I look at the world that you're inheriting and that you're exiting into in terms of what a disaster it is economically, with the pandemic, with climate change, there is so much that that needs to be done and that needs to be changed. And yet I'm really encouraged by the sort of, in a way, the sort of radicalization of your generation as they look forward and they see no future in the current set of arrangements, and so we have to build a different future and build a different economy in order to for you to be able to have any kind of decent living going forward. So hope rests with young generations, I think, and we see this, whether it's climate change or ethical investment or across the board on these issues. So I'm really encouraged by the sort of politicization of young people as they see everything that's wrong and everything that needs changing. Keep up the good work.
Perfect then for our festival. So Felix, no pressure, and I'm sure you've got broad shoulders. You can do it. Give us hope. Thank you, Felix.
My best to do
And
so.
thank you, Joe. Very interesting. Really good. Thanks.
Thank
Bye
you so
for now.
much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.